As the UK government mulls the idea of using frozen Russian assets to help pay for the rebuilding of war-torn Ukraine, ministers appear to have failed to realise that a simple weapon against sanctioned assets is within their reach. That is introducing a provision forcing sanctioned oligarchs to disclose all their assets in the UK. Today, I'll be discussing this idea that could make a huge difference to Ukraine with the author of these words, Maria Nizzero. We'll be discussing whether it is moral or feasible to funnel the assets of rich Russians to pay for the crimes of a regime that they enabled. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. All our content is also available on popular podcasting platforms like Spotify and Apple Podcasts. Please like and subscribe to help new people find our fantastic speakers. And of course, if you enjoy the content, do consider supporting us by becoming a patron. Maria Nizzero is a research fellow at the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies of the Royal United Services Institute. Her research focuses on UK economic crime, the foreign policy dimension of illicit finance, asset recovery, kleptocracy, and corporate transparency. Her work is important to the war in Ukraine as she is currently looking at ways to recover frozen sanctioned assets. Maria has extensive knowledge of and deep personal interest in the topics of European Union politics, illicit finance and security studies, organised crime and terrorism. She is a former associate professor of EU politics and currently a PhD candidate in the law programme at UPF, International Public Law and International Relations Department. Maria, I hope that was all accurate and I hope I captured the essence of your speciality.
Thank you for having me. Yes.
Fantastic. Well, I absolutely was enthralled by some of the articles you've written and what I saw on LinkedIn, which is where I found you. And this debate about sanctioned oligarch assets, which, you know, it's in the press, it's talked about, people think it's a great popular option, but we're going to explore whether that is feasible at all. Before we jump into that, though, I'd love to learn a bit more about what the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies do and who is involved.
Yes, sure. So let me start by saying that the CFCS is one of the departments within the Royal United Services Institute, which is, I think, the oldest security think tank in the world. It was established by Queen Victoria, I think, back in 1831 or somewhere over there. So we started as a security and military think tank, but obviously as we went through, the 21st century, security has slightly changed. So it's not just guns and tanks anymore, but security is multifaceted, including obviously financial crime. And because of that, the director of the Centre for Financial Crime and Security Studies, Tom Keating, he started the centre to look exactly at this, what's the intersection between finance and security. So looking at the different aspects of financial crime, which could be, for instance, the matter, obviously, as you presented in the interview, like introduction, the matter of kleptocracy, corruption, sanctions, they're all intertwined. And at some point, you always end up saying it's all about the money, isn't it? So I study, even my own background, my background is security studies, and I was specializing in terrorism and counterterrorism at the time. And then I realized that without the money, most of the terrorist organizations, they wouldn't really be here. So this is what we do. We look at the money. We do not necessarily do the investigative work that other organizations do, but we provide that technical assistance to policymakers, financial sector, any other type of private institution or academic institutions as well, to understand essentially how can we protect our financial system, but also our security in the meantime.
And it's a complex issue, isn't it? And we'll get into some of the intricacies there because there's a particular focus on Russian oligarchs in light of the war. But actually, this is a multinational problem, isn't it? So the UK is both a haven and a target for oligarchs and, dare I say it, corrupt interests from countries around the world.
Yes, absolutely. I think that, obviously with great powers comes great responsibilities as well. The UK is a major global financial center. And because of that, it is attractive to both, people who want to invest but also criminals who want to invest their illicit money. And it's not just London, it's the UK, generally speaking, as a very, very fertile ground for illicit finance, or for, as a destination for illicit financial flows. But you see it everywhere, really. Anywhere that you have this sort of financial centers, Switzerland, the United States, Singapore lately has been quite of a focus, Hong Kong. So everywhere that there is money, criminals are going to look at it and say, okay, so are there enough protections? Is it safe for me to actually hide the money there? And most of the times the answer is yes. And so they just use it.
And money isn't just abstract, it buys lifestyle, doesn't it? And that's something else that the UK offers. It offers the property investment opportunities, but actually the lifestyle, if you want to actually sort of settle here or drop in to check up on your money. It offers the private school system, which of course is attractive, private tutors, etc., and of course, not just the legal framework that allows people to protect their money, whether that money is completely sort of pucker, or whether that money is illicit, and a very sophisticated, large legal establishment, private legal establishment, which is able to help people not just sort of protect their money, but we'll also talk about sort of reputations and the use of litigation to protect illicit funds as well. I mean, these are all bound up in what the UK offers.
Yeah, if I were to think of a country that has made life of kleptocrats much easier and much more attractive, it has been the UK over the past 20 years. Is everything that you said. It's not just the financial sector, which is obviously very attractive, but it's the real estate, it's the universities, it's the art market. London and in the UK in general, they are so good at attracting all these kind of amazing things that for you and I might be just something really worth, it's a country worth living in. But if I were a kleptocrat and I find out that those sectors are not protected, then it's amazing for me as well. And yes, the legal sector and the accountancy sectors, all those so-called professional enablers, I think that's definitely one peculiarity of the United Kingdom in specific. Also similar in other places like Switzerland or the United States. But what the UK has is also what you said, all these laws that empower even more these professional enablers to do their job, obviously, which is helping both rich individuals and not. Obviously, like every individual can be like rich and not corrupt, but obviously that part as well.
Well, let's turn to Russians, because obviously in the light of the war, that has a particular focus. And I mean, the articles of yours that I was really attracted to was discussing how Russian assets could be frozen. And when we talk about assets, we're not just talking about, and we're not talking about sort of government investments as such. We're talking about individuals who can plausibly say that they are, they don't have an influence on the government and they're not part of the government, etc. But we know from research, we know from recent information and understanding how the Russian system works, that actually an oligarch, well, I mean, you could question whether there are oligarchs anymore. They don't have a huge amount of political influence, and yet they could not exist. They could not have pilfered their wealth. They could not even have acquired their wealth, even semi-legally, and retained it unless they had, that sort of support of the government, which means that oligarchs in Russia are far more associated with the regime than I think people have previously suspected.
Yeah, I think that, when the whole, the further aggression, I would love to say, like, it was not that it started in February 2022. Obviously, we have seen it happening since 2014. Sanctions were already rolled out then, but the response was not enough, probably, or actually not probably, it was not enough. So when the further aggression of Russia against Ukraine happened, that's when a sort of alarm and a bell started ringing in everybody's head and saying, oh, actually there are all these oligarchs, they park their money in the UK. Aside from the fact that this money has been present in the UK for much, much longer time, than we realize, because most of these individuals, they probably started amassing large amounts of wealth in the collapse of the Soviet Union. So we're talking about 30 years ago. So definitely there has been some sort of connection with the government that has allowed them, to plunder the money in Russia from 1990s onwards, but also there has been, a connection with the UK government, well, not government, but with the UK for a long time that allowed them obviously to park their money here. And I think that what happened with the invasion of Ukraine was that they realized, oh, we have to do something about these assets. We have to do something about these individuals, but we cannot obviously use and recur just to the usual ways that we will respond to a military aggression. So what else can we do? And the answer is, oh, we have all this money. Let's go after this money. Let's go after the individuals. And that's when the whole matter of freeze to seize and the whole idea of getting and confiscating this money started, being discussed in Parliament, in other places, because the UK is not the only place that it's talking about this. But I think that what you pointed out about whether it is actually worth it, it's quite interesting, because the first thing that I've always said is, why do we want to get these assets? Is it because we're trying to respond to the aggression? Is it because we are arguing that by taking these assets, they will have some sort of influence over the Kremlin, to change their actions in Ukraine? Or is it because we are finally understanding that this is dirty money that has been here for a long time, polluting our system and also endangering our security in the meantime? And therefore, we need to tackle them regardless of whether they are Russian money or whether, they're from other places in the world. So, but are we tackling them because they're dirty, or are we tackling them because they're connected to Ukraine? And that's a question that I keep on asking, and potentially not a lot of people are answering still. So that's quite an interesting one, I think.
And of course, it is low friction, isn't it, for a politician to label the dirty money problem as a purely Russian problem. And no one is going to go and protest if a couple of Russian oligarchs have their wealth sort of sanctioned. Now, we'll come to how oligarchs can actually fight back, because they do have some tools in their toolbox to help protect their wealth. But in terms of sort of, PR and public opinion and the press even, they could probably get some brownie points in the press by bashing Russian oligarchs. But as you say, that is only solving one manifestation of the problem. And once the headline has moved on, the practicalities of how they do that, again, are not being addressed, are they? So there must be a chain of events that would have to happen in order to create a regime, a legalistic regime, whereby you could actually take those assets. I mean, some of them are already frozen, but frozen doesn't mean you can actually do anything with them. There needs to be a whole set of legislation in place, doesn't there, from taking a frozen asset to taking ownership of that, to then transferring ownership of that to another organization, potentially one that might be involved in rebuilding Ukraine. And that's another can of worms we'll come to in a minute. But could you outline the kind of legal processes that would be required to make frozen assets into something that could actually be deployed to the benefit of Ukraine?
Yeah, so let's start by saying that the assets, obviously, that are currently sanctioned, they are frozen. They are, well, depending on whether we're talking about state or individuals' assets, we even have to use different words. For instance, central bank assets of Russia, they are immobilized, which is technically the same, but slightly different. In the case of the individuals, their assets are frozen. It means that they are there, they cannot be touched, mainly because they're serving the purpose of sanctions. Sanctions are a tool of usually foreign policy that is aimed at changing behavior. So we place a sanction because we're expecting these individuals, as I said, to have enough influence on the Kremlin to change the actions of the Kremlin and of Russia in Ukraine. Now, whether this is possible or not, whether they actually have that influence, it's another question. But for the time being, because of sanctions and because the way the sanctions have been always, envisioned, those assets are frozen. And once, hopefully soon, the war in Ukraine is over, sanctions are lifted, the assets will be unfrozen and they are returned to their rightful owners. In the case of the oligarchs, we have an additional point that I was saying, which is the fact that we would assume that for most of them, it's dirty money. So when we talk about dirty money, we're talking about proceeds of crime, proceeds of corruption, which is a completely separate issue than sanctions. Sanctions, as I said, is foreign policy. Proceeds of crime is criminal justice. So for that, we need a different legal framework, which in the UK is, in the case of sanctions, is SAMLA, so the Sanction Act, and in the case of proceeds of crime is the POCA, so Proceeds of Crime Act. These two things are very different. So when we talk about proceeds of crime and we talk about asset recovery, then we need to establish that those assets are proceeds of crime, as I said, which means we need evidence, we need a very sound and robust investigation, we need law enforcement capable of following the case for a long time and just, go to court and prove either beyond reasonable doubt if we're going after the individual itself, or on the balance of probability if we're going just after the assets, that these assets are linked to a crime. In the case of the oligarchs, I'm sorry to say, but it's basically impossible. It's not something that they haven't tried here in the UK. We had some tools that could have been used already against these individuals. Unexplained wealth orders are one. Probably you heard some of the most famous cases. There are not many. That's the point. There are only 4. So that already shows that there are limitations. And the main reasons are, well, first of all, if we're looking at the crime, the original crime, the original sin, which is corruption in Russia in the 1990s, how would you collect that sort of evidence? Because the crime is historic. It happened at a time where potentially most of the corrupt practices, they were legal in Russia. And if we were to even manage to get that evidence, how do we get it from Russia, which is not just uncooperative, it's completely hostile at this moment. So we have to park the idea of going after the crime in the 1990s. So when I said this, it was like, okay, so if we cannot go to the crime in the 1990s in Russia, let's go look at what is happening in Ukraine. But then again, the assets, how would you link an apartment in Kensington to war crimes in Ukraine? So the present, it's very, very difficult, unless for potentially some individuals who are connected to some private military firms, that are currently funding. You cannot connect, you cannot do that link. So it came to me in a way of saying, okay, so if we cannot look at the then and there, if we cannot look at the now and there still, shall we look at the here and now? So what these assets are doing in London, what are these assets doing here in the UK? And as we have said, most at the beginning, right now they are representing a matter of national security. So let's look at ways to actually link it to a crime to a security issue rather than a crime in itself. But at present, to go back to your question, we simply do not have any legal mechanisms to do so. We could try potentially with some very easy cases, the low-hanging fruits, but the oligarchs have been very, very good at mixing their assets for such a long time that even if I were the most skilled investigators, and I've met many within the NCA, they just don't have the capacity to do so.
So all the impounded yachts, the properties, etc., none of this stuff can technically, or very little of the stuff can technically be transitioned in as far as its ownership to a purpose. And you say this split between the individual and the sort of corporate responsibility of a state. Does that also make it much more difficult in this concept of restitution for Ukraine? So potentially mobilized central government assets, that might be an easier path to use those funds, because you can make the case that the Russian state is engaged in a genocidal war and these are state assets. Whereas the individuals who may tacitly support the regime, who may enable the regime through their lack of criticism of it, they may even be involved in some kind of, financial instruments or business arrangements within Russia that are supporting the Russian war economy. But are you saying that it's then practically impossible to take any of those assets and actually transition them to Ukraine for rebuilding?
So obviously it's very different for state and individuals' assets. In the case of individuals' assets, it's what I said. Unless you prove that these are proceeds of crime, the Sanctions Act doesn't have any mechanism that would allow, to move from the freezing to the permanent confiscation. In the case of state assets, we have even more complicated issues that are, I don't want to go too much into the legalese, but they all draw back. If you look at, a lot of people actually have written about it, the matter of sovereign immunity, which basically means that they are protected within the UK, obviously Russian assets, matters of war reparations as well. So international law is coming into the conversations. This does not mean that they cannot be touched. I think that there are some countries that are being potentially more, how can I say, more innovative, more creative about it. The European Union is being quite active in trying to find ways. For instance, they proposed this idea of putting the central bank assets in a trust fund, and then to reinvest the money, so the profits of these investments for Ukraine, and just redirecting that. Whether this is possible, it's a bit of a complicated matter. But right now, within the UK, that definitely is neither, that there is no option. Some MPs, Chris Bryan, for instance, he has proposed a bill for the seizure of state assets and repurposing for the reconstruction of Ukraine. But they haven't really been discussed much, because all these issues that I said, sovereign immunity, war reparations, they all come back into the discussion. So you always find yourself in front of a stumbling block, because everybody wants to do it. Legally speaking, you cannot do it, at least from the state assets part. And for the individual's assets part, more issues arise, which are, as I said, obviously, if you cannot prove the crime, we're going down to a very concerning path of, just because these individuals were in a picture with, some government official in Russia, does that mean that their assets are now, up to confiscation? That goes back to property rights, that goes back to due process concerns. And we don't want to put the UK at the same level of a regime that we're supposedly standing against. It's a path down to authoritarianism that it's very dangerous, I'd say.
And that's the interesting part of it, isn't it? Is that we're working within a legal framework. We're working within a rules-based society, which to an extent is at a disadvantage when it is trying to tackle Russia. Russia, for those who don't yet fully appreciate, is not a rules-based society. If you do something or say something that the regime does not agree with, then you're not only will you lose your status in society, you will probably lose all of your possessions, your businesses, your money. There are no protections. So in essence, the state, power, and wealth are part of the same sort of organism. And it's not rules-based, it's power-based. And yet we're fighting this entity from a rules-based society, which technically puts the disadvantage on the sort of case-by-case basis. In the big picture, however, corruption and nepotism in Russia is one of the major reasons. I mean, not to diminish the efforts of Ukraine and the army, but one of the biggest reasons Ukraine is winning is because Russian nepotism and corruption has made their army hopelessly ill-equipped and trained and incompetent. So the big picture is that corruption works in our favor, I think, in trying to tackle authoritarian regimes. But on the case-by-case basis, it sounds like it makes it extremely difficult for us to move forward and do anything quickly. I mean, this is the other aspect of this. It doesn't sound like this is a process of litigation that could take years, if not decades, to unravel.
Yeah, I actually have been asked, and some people I spoke with, they were very adamant in saying Russia is not behaving within the rule of law. So why should we? And my response to that is because we are democracies, because we're trying to uphold those standards for everybody's protection, because we don't want to become Russia in the long run. Because of that, there is these sort of big distinctions, but because of the rule of law, most of the protections that I said, they are there for a reason. They're there to protect, Russian oligarchs, but also they're there to protect you and I. What happens when, rather than Russia, it's going to be somewhere else? Would you be feeling in the same way? And one of the arguments that a lot of people are talking about, obviously, the violations of human rights. Russia is not the only one. It's not the only country that is, violating human rights, not just in Ukraine, but also in its own country against some of its citizens. So will we apply the same measures to other countries, some that potentially right now have been more favorable to the UK? And that's when the whole audience usually stays silent for a while. And that is already indicative, I think it's obviously an odd one out to say, like, to be speaking in defense of these rights. But the way that I look at it is I look at the broader picture. I look at whether this is going to have longer term consequences, because right now it's Russia, next is potentially China, it's Saudi Arabia. So I want to be careful, and I want to make sure that whatever measure that we're going to, draft today, it's going to be applicable right now, but also tomorrow. And so there is this sort of trying to avoid the exceptionalism of the situation and do something that is still within, the rule of law and protects everybody's rights in the process.
And I think this is a crucial point, because you'll know on the channel, we have a lot of speakers about disinformation and propaganda, and that was the origins of the channel. But obviously, we've broadened out into many other topics, and we're going to be examining other places, China, etc. But there is a very close link, actually, between propaganda and rule of law. And the minute we as a society undermine or break the rules that we claim to champion, that gives a huge gift to the propagandists, and what turns out to be the illegal foundations of the Iraq War, the Second Iraq War, and many other sort of alliances and partnerships throughout the world, and many actions of not only our government, but the US, etc., over the years, that people can point to as undermining, the very institutions and rules that they put in place. That gives a huge gift to authoritarian regimes. The inverse of that is that the best defense against disinformation and propaganda is actually living by the rules that we set and showing an example. And we're not perfect at that, but it would seem that this financial conversation therefore has a direct connection to, the topics of health of democracy and fighting disinformation.
Absolutely. I think that's also the other side, of the equation, this matter of disinformation. There is, again, a financing of this disinformation behind it. And one of the reasons why we often, when we talk about dirty money, we do not necessarily just say financial crime, but we talk about illicit finance, is that because there is a strategic use, in a way, of finance for, other purposes, for instance, undermining democracy, spreading disinformation. And it's in a blurred, it's in a gray area, because it's not a crime in itself. However, it's illicit because it has as a further purpose the one of undermining our institutions. And I think that, we have seen it with Russia very well. They have done it for a lot of years, of this it's just not spreading this information, is interfering with elections, even just simply, making the financial system more unstable. That is a way, obviously, to infiltrate in our society. But everybody has learned from the Russian playbook quite well. So I would not be surprised if, in a couple of years, we're seeing the same tactics. Actually, we're already seeing most of the Russian tactics, being applied today. So that's the other part of the equation, to think about it in more strategic terms. And I think that, when we talk about these things, obviously it's so impactful what is happening in Ukraine, that we tend to forget that we have not just one open door, in the back. We have multiple doors and with windows open, and everybody's basically trying to infiltrate from a lot of sides, let's say.
The question then becomes, and turning to one of your earlier points, are we protected enough? So because of the experiences of prohibition and fighting, mafia activity in the US, they have a lot of laws which I believe in the UK we do not have, which is sort of racketeering type legislation. Do we in the UK need to develop this kind of anti-mafia framework to our financial laws and protections in order to protect ourselves from corrupt oligarch and illicit money?
So let's start by saying that the US model is actually framed, it was modeled upon the Italian one, which obviously, as we probably all know, has had a bit of an issue with mafia groups for like over centuries, I'd say. I'm Italian myself, so I have seen it firsthand. And what happened with the Italian anti-mafia code and then with the US Racketeering Act is that they were a response to a specific issue. It was not just a financial crime issue, it was a social issue. They were having a serious impact. They were representing, they were a serious social danger, a danger to their society, a danger to their security as well. So there was that sort of understanding. And in the UK, up until now, probably, there was not that sort of understanding of illicit finance as a national security issue. Which was seen a slight change. The integrated review, there was a reiteration was published a couple of months ago, still talks about illicit finance as a security problem. The integrated review of 2021 actually was dedicating much of a bigger, obviously focus. We're now like the IR 2023 is a response to geopolitical changes, but it's interesting how these have started shifting a bit in the UK. We're still very far, obviously, from seeing the sort of understanding. And what US laws and what Italian laws have, obviously, they cannot apply right now to the oligarchs either. But one of the conversations that I've actually had quite often is how these oligarchs, if you look at the definitions of grand corruptions, if you look at the definitions of kleptocracy, there are very few, but they're there. There are not so many differences with organized crime. If you look at the way that the oligarchs from the 1990s, but even the most recent years, they have structured themselves, how they also, for instance, use professional enablers. They have that sort of organized structure that is very similar to organized criminal groups. So obviously with the right caveats, potentially, exploring that organized crime angle could be an interesting solution, I think.
I mean, that does remind me, and I've mentioned it in a couple of the videos, and I think I was asking, I can't remember, it was Yuri Fershinsky or somebody else, what books you should read to understand the Putin regime. And I was thinking sort of, weighty geopolitical tomes, and he just said Mario Puzo's The Godfather. And there's that is still some resistance to trying to understand both oligarchs and Putin's regime, and relate those to the mechanics of how a mafia syndicate would work. Khodorkovsky has been making this point for many, many years, and saying that we should have no dealings with a mafia-style regime because they're an entirely different creature to our own societies, and any dealings with them put that sort of veneer of respectability onto them. But my question is going to be, there are other similarities too between, if you do watch, The Godfather or any of those sort of movies, how they spend their money and where they put their assets has some similarity as well. Huge properties, commercial properties, yachts, restaurants, and especially stashing in art. Do we have a sense of what the most popular or largest vehicles for depositing illegal assets are? And are they monetary sort of deposits, or do they put them into physical sort of objects like art and property?
That's a great question. I don't think that there is actually a proper analysis of whether, what is the preferred method of laundering or packing money. I think that everything that you mentioned, it's it's definitely quite spot on. Obviously, when we talk about property is there, it's physically keeps on, rising in value, especially if you're in London, unfortunately. But art is another great one because, art is subjective. You look at it, you look at something and you say, oh, this is art to me. But maybe for somebody else, it's just your kid's latest drawing, which I'm sure is going to be art, but obviously, not worth potentially millions of dollars. I think the one difference potentially between the oligarchs and a general organized or mafia organization is the use of financial offshore centers much more. And that is very much something that it's more financial crimey rather than organized crimey, which still there are some differences. So they have benefited quite a lot from lack of transparency of some offshore centers, but not exclusively. Corporate registries everywhere they're not great in storing information. So definitely there is much more of a reliance on financial secrecy than in other places, than in other groups. Other things, I think that it's probably the extensive use of every tool at their disposal, every legislative tool. So it's not just that they rely on the professional enabler, on the lawyer, on the accountant, but this path that we were talking about, for instance, spreading disinformation or silencing even those who oppose them or who have, are on the right path of actually discovering something about them, that is, I think, much more powerful and much more utilized than by oligarchs than a general mafia member. So, for instance, here in the UK, libel laws have been one of the most favorite tools. Reputation laundering as well. That is less of a mafia strategy. Honestly, I don't think that the mafia really cares. The oligarchs, they do care about that status. So that's something that is peculiar of their side.
And there are features of UK law which enable that to happen. I mean, several journalists have recently been sued by oligarchs, and it does have an effect of muzzling the press and muzzling investigations. And it's one of the reasons we're not going to name any individuals on this podcast, because I don't have a sort of high-priced lawyer to help me out. But it is a problem also for large sort of media organizations as well. And if we take that sort of environment of, let's say, sort of the ability to muzzle public opinion, which I think is a little bit different in the US. There is more of an emphasis on free speech. We also have, and we have to tackle this idea of territories that have far looser arrangements and poor accounting, as you mentioned. Well, many of these are British dominions and territories. So the UK is far more involved in this global web of laundering illicit money. It's not just about mainland UK.
Yeah, I often have this sort of conversation, that people ask me when they find out that I'm Italian. They're like, oh, what are you doing in London, studying financial crime? Shouldn't you be in Italy tackling organized crime or whatever? And I always say, for an Italian to actually go to the UK and study economic crime there, it means that the problem is quite big. And I think it has so much more repercussions internationally than the UK government potentially would like to believe, because obviously the fact that we have allowed all this money to come to the UK to be laundered and then potentially being even reinvested to finance what right now is, an atrocity in Ukraine, that money also went through London, and it's time for us to potentially be honest about it. I don't think that the government is still that open about it. Most of the conversations that we're having, obviously we're seeing a lot of response. We've seen the Economic Crime Act one, which was very welcome. We're seeing now the Economic Crime Bill being discussed in the Lords. So there is something, being done. But then again, the reform of Companies House, which is the UK's company registry, I seem to recall my boss talking about it something like 15 years ago. So, it took a long time to get there. It shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have been a war to finally wake everybody up. We have been letting all this money in. And I think that it's very easy to say to the other countries, oh, you should fix your own problem without necessarily doing anything at home. So I'm seeing a bit of a change in the UK, but we're still far from ideal, obviously.
And talking of laundering reputations, I mean, this comment won't go down well with some of the viewers here, but one of the most sort of vocal and actually impassioned, because I do think he genuinely believes this, supporters of Ukraine is Boris Johnson. And I think that is not just expedient. I think that is heartfelt. He doesn't have to sort of beat that drum anymore, and yet he is doing that. However, he did preside over Londongrad. He did preside over, as mayor of London, this system which allowed Russian oligarch money to come here in vast floods, and one could say that there was indirect benefits to him potentially from doing that, without making any specific allegations. And that tells you something about the problem, doesn't it? At the moment, it's expedient to beat the Russians up on this topic, but there's not much political capital in say sort of beating up Chinese oligarchs yet, or not until they invade Taiwan, or Saudi oligarchs, or whoever they happen to be. And this is one of the real challenges here, isn't it, of political self-interest and expediency.
I think that there is also an interesting, like a way of understanding business that it's flawed, in my opinion. We've been made to believe that any type of business is good business, any investment is good investment. So for a long time we're talking about open Britain, global Britain, and the idea was we're being open to everything and every opportunity. If we're closing, the specific gaps, then we're going to harm the economy. We're going to potentially not seeing all those flows of investments. But then again, there is good investment and bad investment. Right now, the money that has come into it has not been reinvested in the UK, like in UK economy. It has not benefited the citizens of the UK. It has benefited Russian criminals. So I think that's also a quite of a change in mind that needs to happen, and I haven't really seen it yet, because even when I talk about it now, about, for instance, increasing transparency, strengthening our corporate registry, there is a sort of hesitancy, and say, oh, but would this harm the economy? And I'm saying, well, honestly, I think that the other things have potentially harmed more the UK economy than, a sounder corporate registry. But that is still there to happen. Like, I haven't really seen it. And if you look at companies' house reform, which is great, most of it is just basic stuff. What we will have to see is secondary legislation. Now, will that secondary legislation happen soon? I really don't know. I've seen a couple of points in the economic crime plan too that was that's just come out that was not really ambitious. Some things that just say when parliamentary times allow. That wording should not exist when we talk about financial crime, because it's a priority. It needs to become a priority, and it's not right now.
And yes, as you say, none of this money really benefits UK citizens. It doesn't increase the flow of taxes that help enhance our state or the health service, but it does drive up property prices. It does drive up the cost of services, whether they be legal services or education services, and it prevents people, say, from living in central London, which many watching this will know that is an incredible issue. Does it, however, also harm our democracy in other ways? Now, I know this is very difficult to actually quantify and potentially put your finger on, but have decades of oligarch influence where they peddle influence, they engage in lobbying, they engage in litigation, has that had a slow corrupting influence on our political institutions and those who inhabit them?
Well, I'd say so. I mean, more than in the UK, probably it's even more visible in the United States, with electoral interference. That has been, quite proved lately with investigations. But it's everything really. It's not just what we're seeing right now in terms of election results, but it's also the mindset that we're having towards news and towards everything really. Because if I were even just talking about slaps and there are the so-called libel suits, if I were a journalist and I know that behind me there's not going to be a major newspaper backing me in case, a libel suit is actually initiated against me, I will not publish a specific article. I will just stay silent. So that already is changing the way that information is spread and is given to the public, the way that we receive the news. We probably don't know as many things as we should probably know as general public, and that will influence the way that we make informed decisions when we go and vote potentially. So that definitely has impacted our institutions and our democracy. And I think that generally speaking, talking for instance for Italy, that there were stories of far-right parties receiving funding from obviously Russian affiliates, and the way that I've seen, then the Italian even elections results, that was indicative of how powerful they were, and they were everywhere in the media. If you are somebody, from the general public, and you keep on being proposed the same narrative, after a while you end up buying it. That's the purpose of propaganda in the end, and that's the purpose of disinformation. So definitely we've seen a deterioration of our democratic institutions that it's quite unprecedented, considering how much information we can digest on a daily basis. And for the UK specifically, I won't make a lot of comments, but I think that is quite indicative that the Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, the UK is one of the countries that has seen the biggest dropping in the ranking. That is already, I don't know, it speaks for itself, in my opinion.
Absolutely. I mean, you mentioned also the Italian media and the influence of oligarchy, and I think the slide towards oligarchy in the US, and the inflow of money into the political system, the impact of oligarchic influence on the media in the UK, all these are a concern. But as I say, Italy shows us what can happen when that sort of rampages unchecked for several decades. I mean, if we mention the word Berlusconi there, who actually pioneered much of this system, and in fact, many of the propaganda formats you now see on Russian TV, those formats were pioneered by Berlusconi and his TV networks. But what that actually leads to is a far more sort of ambiguous coverage of the Ukraine war in Italy than you'd say get in the UK, where if you read certain sections of the media, you could equate victim and aggressor in the same view, and that's deeply troubling, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that's actually potentially the starker difference that I find whenever I go back home. Here in the UK, it's very rare for anybody, really, to question what is happening in Ukraine. When I go back to Italy, it is very, very likely that there's going to be not just a conversation, when you are at dinner with friends, but even in the news, on public television, that debate will happen. And experts who have been known, to either be funded by the Russian government or being affiliated in some sort, they are out there publicly talking against the Ukrainian government, or highlighting issues such as, for instance, issues that are still there. And this is, again, brings back something that we were saying, before. The moment that you start, eroding your own rule of law, the authoritarian regimes, they will use it as a weapon. So one of the things, for instance, that is often, brought up is the matter of corruption in Ukraine, which is an issue. The Ukrainian government is struggling, was struggling before the war, especially with corruption. It's not something that we didn't know about it. But that is used by the propagandists and, Russian supporters to say, oh, but there's a reason why this is happening, So it's very subtle sometimes, but the way that the public, even people who you would assume they are informed, sometimes I find some friends of mine just telling me things, and I'm like, what do you know about this? And they're like, oh, I read it on this newspaper. And then you see that the information has already been distorted slightly. In the UK, I don't think that there is. I mean, it's happening, but it's slowly. It's happening slowly, and I think, at least for the time being, the support to Ukraine is so strong, and that is also thanks to Boris Johnson. I think that he has done an amazing job in rallying behind and just creating this support for Ukraine. Now it's a matter of not just supporting them, but protecting us in the meantime.
And the last two questions lead very sort of closely on from that, and they're about Russia and Ukraine. So we'll do Ukraine last, because I think it's right to sort of end on the fight for corruption in Ukraine and with the potential accession to the EU. So we'll come to that in a minute. But it also can be seen that oligarch corruption is having a deeply negative effect on Russian opposition. Russian opposition is fragmented and divided at the best of times. Some of the most articulate and unambiguous voices of the Russian opposition are in jail, like Karamurza, Ilya Yashin. And of those who are in the West, there is always, of course, the temptation to serve not just the abstract interests of democracy, but to serve individuals' interests. And we see with Leonid Volkov, who was ostensibly Navalny's number two, he has recently had to resign because he was openly lobbying to get sanctions lifted for one of Russia's most notorious oligarchs. So this oligarchy and corruption can actually, in Russia, potentially even prevent democracy from emerging or making any inroads into that society.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there are very interesting, especially when we talk about the oligarchs, we have to think about them not just as an elite, but also as businessmen, as people who want to still, use their assets for whatever thing that they wanted to do. So definitely they will keep on using, what they still have, because a lot of it is hidden. They will keep on using it to their own benefits, potentially, not just for the benefit of the Kremlin, but also for their own benefit. So it's not the first time that I also heard, people talking about, oh, what if we just, some oligarchs came to us and said, what do I have to pay to have sanctions lifted? And then it comes to the question, would you lift the sanction and keep the money if the oligarchs would be okay with it? But what would happen once again to our rule of law, to our jurisdictions, and to the way that we think about justice, generally speaking? And these are all questions that it's a sort of a blur line between what is moral, what is just, and what it's needed. And sometimes the different words, they collide when we talk about the oligarchs, and that's why also they have lived for such a long time undisturbed, because they walk along those blur lines very, very efficiently, and they keep on pushing for the lines to be expanded and for that gray area to be expanded for their purposes. So it's very dangerous.
And, there's a simple rule of thumb. I mean, this might seem incredibly crude, but there's a simple rule of thumb, I think, and that is, if an oligarch has their assets in place, and if they have any assets at all in Russia, any assets at all, it means they're a regime enabler. It is, I think, as simple as that. Because if we look at Tinkov, if we look at others, if we look at very sort of vocal rich Russians who left quite a long time ago, like Chichvarkin, anyone even remotely critical of the government will have their assets seized. So there's a very, very simple guide here. If they still have their money and if they have interest in Russia, they are in some ways an asset of the Russian regime. And if they've had their assets taken, frozen in Russia, reappropriated to somebody else, then, it's a very easy way to tell which ones are which. And maybe that's a little overly crude, but I think it gives a sense that, a free oligarch is there's no such thing, actually, as a free oligarch.
Yeah, I always, it all comes down to what we're trying to do with these assets, because obviously, again, if sanctions are there for a reason, we would argue that the sanctions are there because we are assuming that the oligarchs have some sort of power to influence decisions, that is very debatable. That is potentially the opposite, of how much power they have, or rather how much they are still prisoners in a way because their assets are still in Russia, and how much they're fearing. I think it's both. It's both. They have that power, but they also know that they are constrained up to a limit, considering that their assets are still in Russia. It's a bit of it's complicated when you think about it, and that's another point that we will have to think more strategically. And this is why asset recovery becomes complicated, because it's not just about justice, it's also about foreign policy. You have to be strategic about it. We have a war that is taking place in Ukraine right now, so we have to also think what would happen, to, like, if we did this to the assets, what would happen then in Ukraine, what will happen to the oligarchs, etc., etc. So it's a lot of words that are colliding all together, and that obviously complicates matters even more.
It does, doesn't it? And of course, oligarchs are essentially individuals, atomized individuals within a totalitarian system. And in order to exert political influence, they would have to act as a class. They would have to have some kind of class consciousness beyond just their love of yachts and 6 foot sort of blonde models, etc. They would actually have to put in place or organize in some way in order to exert political influence. And of course, none of that exists. We know that they don't act as a class or in the interests of society. I mean, one of the reasons they've taken their money out of Russia and put it somewhere else is they do not care about Russian society or the future of it, no matter what sort of patriotic sentiments they may come out with. Their actions say that they have no cares whatsoever for the future of that country. It's simply something to be plundered. But the last question, I think, because we're sort of running on time, I always like to end on Ukraine, because Ukraine obviously has the victims, but also Ukrainian society is very forward-looking, and that is one of the reasons why they're resisting, Russian oppression. So they have had and still continue to have issues with corruption. War does seem to have spurred them to take action and to start to dismantle some of the oligarch influence within, say, the media environment. So very interesting changes taking place. But from your point of view, what further needs to happen for Ukrainian accession to the EU and for this major release of rebuilding funds? But also, what needs to happen to stop things like the port of Odessa being a massive conduit for, illicit products and illicit money, being siphoned out of the East into Europe and potentially, corrupting the European system further?
So I will start by saying that I haven't seen anywhere else aside from Ukraine, like, as much of an interest in actually, doing, like, tackling corruption and being transparent as I've seen, happening in Ukraine of the past year. I think that the Ukrainian government has done quite a lot, especially considering, that it's still fighting a war in the meantime. So what I've seen, like the judiciary reform, some of the asset recovery laws that they even brought forward, their sanctions regime is very strong. Obviously, this is, I think that it's quite important for Ukrainian society also to fully embark on this journey. So it's not just a matter of the government to provide the laws. The laws are very nice in place, but obviously if you don't have the full buy-in from the societal side, that obviously is not going to work. So I think that probably, I don't know if there has been yet that much of a change in understanding of all Ukrainian society. If you've read, obviously, Oliver Bullock's, the first one, the first book, I think it was Moneyland, wasn't it?
There's Moneyland, Butlers of the World, and he also had a fantastic sort of, political travel writing book on Russia. I can't recall the name of it, but
I meant Moneyland because he talks about quite a lot about Ukrainian society pre-2014, and that's very evident that it was spread across multiple sectors. So it was not just the government. So I think that it was very embedded. before the war. So it will take a long time to eradicate all the different instances of corruption. But I see already that there's a lot of intention, and all the Ukrainian people that I've worked with, especially activists, I think that they're very adamant in ensuring that whatever money is going to come in is going to go in the right places, also because there is a whole country to rebuild. So I'm sure that in that sense, we're going to see some potential. In terms of accession to the EU, this I put back my associate professor at. It's a long process. It's not something that is going to happen quickly. And again, it's the same way as asset recovery. It's not something that can happen even within a year. There are countries that have been trying to access to the European Union for years and years and years. Membership, it's not just a matter of political will, it's also a matter of meeting specific requirements and specific criteria. In the case of Ukraine, obviously, we're talking about a country that has been torn by the war. So financially speaking, it will take some time to get to a level that, it's acceptable to be entering into an economic union, because we're seeing with other countries such as Italy that when you actually read the books, that's not good for the economy of all the other countries. So we don't want to happen again with Ukraine. But, usually the membership is the first conditions are the so-called Copenhagen criteria, and one of them to have a stable democracy and rule of law. Then you have a functioning market, and then the acceptance of EU legislation. I think that for the first and the last one, so stable democracy and rule of law, Ukraine is doing impressive steps to get there, and acceptance of EU legislation as well, because it's already putting its laws in accordance. So I'm positive. It's not going to be quick. I'm sorry to say, but I know that everybody just thinks that the Ukraine is going to be a member in a couple of years, but I think it still needs some time. But I'm positive for the future.
Well, that's an incredibly positive place to end on. I know Ukrainians are very much looking to become part of the European institutions and frameworks, and of course looking to NATO accession, which may happen far faster. And in the interim, there may be agreements that provide some sort of temporary cover, for instance, of a sort of northern alliance of states, military alliance, and it may be there are some interim economic steps that could be taken prior to full EU accession. But I think this is definitely something, that is driving them to fight, as well as their love of liberty, which you absolutely get when you talk to Ukrainians. But I have to say, Maria, I'm incredibly grateful. This has been a absolutely fascinating conversation with a lot of energy and a lot of great detail. So I know the audience are going to appreciate that. And thank you so much for your time and your work.
Thank you for having me. It was great.